Annual Full Frame Documentary Film Festival and the A&E Indie Film Speakeasy. This is, I believe, our third speakeasy, and I want to say thank you to Molly Thompson and A&E Indie Films for sponsoring this venue for us. We're going to start off today with this subject called Based on a True Story. And what's so interesting to me about this is that I had asked a couple of people up here to moderate, but they all have so much to say on this, they said, no, I don't want to moderate, I want to talk. So I will do my best to get out of the way and just get us started, because everybody up here has a great deal to share on this topic. And it came to mind because Stephen Nemeth, who is all the way over there opposite me, and I have been friends for many, many years. Stephen has been a very prolific producer in his career, both documentaries and narrative films. But about a year ago, brought a film out which has won numerous awards called The Sessions, which is based on Jessica Yu's film, Somewhat, Breathing Lessons, which won the Oscar for Best Short several years ago. And of course, Helen Hunt was nominated for Best Actress for that film, and John Hawkes won many awards for it. Next to him is Mark Landsman, another returning champion to our festival, and made a film called Thunder Soul, which I know we're going to talk a great deal about. And in the middle, I guess the ultimate returning champion, Nancy Bursky, who just won a Peabody Award, ladies and gentlemen, for The Loving Story, and who I worked briefly with on The Loving Story, and we're going to talk a little about that. And next to her, yet again, another champion of the full frame family, Marshall Curry. Marshall Curry with Street Fight, Racing Dreams, If a Tree Falls, some great, great films, all of which have a tie to this subject. So I want to start with Stephen, simply because you've had such a career with both types of films. And just to talk about a little, let's start with the process with The Sessions, of how that came to be.
Okay. I mean, it really was, The Sessions was really the brainchild of Ben Lewin, the writer and director, who, you know, against all odds at 66 years old, at 4 feet 5 inches tall on crutches, was the darling at Sundance 2 years ago, which I thought was just an incredibly inspiring thing, because, you know, we hear so much and so often that it's a young person's game. It's not. It's a talented person's game at the end of the day. And Ben had actually stumbled across a piece of material, actually an article called On Being a Sex Surrogate in the San Francisco Chronicle, and it was really the story of this woman, Cheryl Cohn Green, who's a 65 or 6-year-old still practicing sex therapist in San Francisco, i.e. not a young person's game, a talented person's game. Apparently she's very talented. In any event, and she has one breast. And it's so she's technically handicapped in that regard, but it makes no difference apparently to her clients, which is a wonderful thing again. And so Ben said, I found an article, and I'm gonna, you know, I want to make it into a movie. What do you think? And blah blah blah. And I said, I think it was amazing. And he had to spec it because no one was going to actually pay to get this screenplay written. And then once it was spec'd, we'd have to put this thing together for as little money as we could possibly put it together for. He and his wife Judy Levine had been into this for quite some time, and that's ultimately what the movie was based on. But then we used we sort of used Jessica's movie as inspiration. She'd written and directed a film called Breathing Lessons, which won an Academy Award about this subject, Mark O'Brien, which turned out to be an invaluable resource for John Hawkes, because that was his that was what he ultimately used to get inside the head of Mark O'Brien, who no longer is alive. So while we didn't buy Jessica's movie, we were inspired by it and used it to make our movie as good as it could possibly be, and we embraced her, and she came to the set, and I think came to the premiere in Sundance and loved it all up.
And it won the Audience Award at Sundance.
Yeah.
Yeah, under the name The Surrogate.
Right. But it's, you know, at the end of the day, oh, and forgive me for bogarting, but I'll pass the torch in a moment. What's interesting also is that it was a short film that she had won, and her famous Oscar speech was, my dress cost more than this movie, isn't that a great thing? Which I thought was wonderful. But I thought, because it was a short film that I think HBO owns and very few people have seen, wouldn't it be a great thing to put her movie, the short film, at the end of our DVD extra? So I spoke to, at the end of our DVD as an extra, spoke to Fox Searchlight, spoke to everybody, and of course, everybody said, great idea, let's do it, great, we're into it, and blah, blah, blah. Nothing. Didn't happen, but it would have been just a wonderful thing to throw on the end of our movie to make both richer and to get more eyes on Jessica's wonderful film.
But the fact is a good story is a good story. And all three of you here have had films that you've made documentaries about, but have some narratives ties to it. Mark, talk a little about Thunder Soul and your original take on that material. It was originally a narrative take you had, correct?
Yeah, I was listening to NPR in 2007, and I heard the story. I actually just heard the music first. It was just funk music, incredible funk music coming through my radio, and I thought, my God, there must be doing a piece on the JBs or the Bar-Kays or one of these classic bands. And Melissa Block came on and said, can you believe these are 14 and 15-year-old high school kids from Houston, Texas, playing this music circa 1971? And literally, that's all I heard, and just got those story chills. And while the radio piece was playing, I Googled the professor, their teacher, Conrad Johnson, and called him, made the call while the program was going on, and guy picked up the phone, and I said, I think I'm listening to you on the radio right now. He said, no, you're listening to my father, but who are you? And I said, I'm a filmmaker, and this has anybody dealt with this material before? And he gave me his father's phone number. And but my first instinct was not documentary; it was narrative. I thought this would be an incredible feature.
So what made the turn? Because I know, Nancy, you went out with the Loving Story both ways. You went out pitching both a narrative and a documentary. So Mark, what made the turn? The
turn was that I got on a plane and I went to Houston to sit with Prof. He was 90 years old at the time, and he had invited all of his former students to come to his house that night when I got there. So there were like 30 of his ex-students in the room, and two of the guys took me aside and they said, can we talk to you for a minute? And we went to lunch the next day, and they said, Prof's not aware of this, but we're going to be doing a reunion, and we're going to get guys together. They're going to come from all over the world back to the old high school band room, and we want to do this for him. What do you think? And I said, I think you've just changed the course of my plan. And that was it. So, and then that became the documentary.
And so, Nancy, you had a slightly different route than that, correct? I mean, because I was actually with you in some of those pitch meetings early on. So can you talk a little about when the road split?
Yeah, the story. You're right. The story is a story. And when I also got that story chill. I love that term. I'm going to use it a little bit if it's okay with you. I read the obituary of Mildred Loving in May of 2008, and I was struck by the fact that no one had done anything on this story, nor had they done anything on miscegenation, the crime that they were accused of committing. And I saw both a documentary and a narrative. It's got great bones for a narrative story. So I put together treatments for both. And it's true, Deidre and I were going to California, and we did a couple of meetings together. We thought there would be every possibility of trying to develop a narrative film. But I kind of left it to destiny. I thought whichever gets traction first is what I'll work on. And I very quickly discovered some of the footage that ended up being in the documentary, and it just took off. I mean, the documentary just kind of was fated to happen, and the narrative just took a longer time. But the documentary helped quite a bit, because by the time I had a trailer that could illustrate their story, I was beginning to talk again about the narrative. And I don't know if you want me to go into the whole story of the development of the narrative.
Well,
I can do that later.
I want to get back to it, because I also want to make, I know Steve and I talked about, and we've all talked before this, about like rights, and especially for filmmakers out there who I think are going to be curious about this, and what do you need to lock down, and what's necessary for a good script as opposed to a doc. But in both circumstances, it sounds like life intervened to a certain extent, right? I mean, if that reunion weren't happening, Thunder Soul would be a different project.
But you brought up the issue of rights. I mean, the first thing that I did with Prof was have a discussion about life rights for a narrative feature, and we actually got that out of the way first. And we went forward full blast with the documentary, but we began with a discussion about, well, this could possibly be, knowing that it's a long road and it's going to take a long time, and that we were doing the documentary first, would you be amenable to this rights situation? And he was.
So Marshall, I mean, different path for you, right?
Yeah. My film Racing Dreams is being developed into a fiction film by DreamWorks, and it's about 3 kids who want to become NASCAR drivers when they grow up. So it's 2 boys and a girl who are 11, 12, and 13, and it's sort of about they race these go-karts that go 70 miles an hour in sort of the Little League for NASCAR. I think we always knew when we were working on it that it should feel like a narrative. It was never. It's a little bit different from some of these stories, because at the time that I was working on it, I was completely focused on it as a documentary.
Right.
But Matt Hamachek and Mary Manhart and I edited it together, and we spent a lot of time thinking about editing it in a way that would feel like a narrative. And so, we'd be sitting in the edit room and say, okay, if this were a fiction film, what would happen here? How would you be introducing characters, or where would the plot twists be, or how would you kind of have these stories overlap? And so, in a way, we began kind of building the first draft of a fiction film. And so when it premiered at Tribeca, it got some attention, and that's when DreamWorks said, oh, well, we see this, and we can see how you've kind of done a lot of the work for figuring out how to tell this story. So so they optioned it.
And I think that's what's exciting here is that, I was rereading an interview with Mr. Pennebaker from '07 the other day, and you said, really, I'm trying to be like Ibsen. I'm trying to create a play, not an educational piece. And we've talked about this a lot, how great documentaries are not necessarily informative pieces. They're storytelling devices. Steve, can you talk, because you've really, more than anybody, have worked on both sides of this. You want to talk a little bit about that, we all know, and we're fans of documentary, truth is stranger than fiction and often more entertaining. But what about that turn? What about that shift into fiction?
Well, I think the important point of this panel and the takeaway for everybody is that Hollywood, or the business, I hate to say either of those words, they give me the creeps, but the movie business loves an underlying right, whether it's a novel or a documentary, and so not everyone can necessarily buy the rights to a famous novel, but you can all conceptualize and come up with a great story, a nonfiction story, and even in many respects, just capture that in a 15-minute short for $375. You then have the underlying rights to something. You have something to propose for a narrative feature that is yours, that didn't really cost you, and that you conceptualize. So I think it's really important that everyone is empowered to be able to do something like that. And I also think it's really important for almost all of these, no matter what they are, even if the subject matter is brutal, to be somewhat, and forgive the term entertaining, you have to Trojan horse the message in order for anybody to see it. Otherwise, it's going to fall on deaf ears, and it doesn't matter what you do. But an interesting story, I actually, much like your journey, was tipped off to a story in a magazine called Dogtown and the Z-Boys about 10 years ago. And I thought, oh my God, this is a great movie. Great movie. I went after it as a narrative feature. There was a woman in my office who also was a line producer. It turned out to be one of the producers, or the producer of the movie, which is another story. But I called Fox. I called the journalist. I called the magazine, who turned me on to the journalist, who said I had just sold the movie rights to Art Linson at Fox. This was like an hour before. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. What about a documentary? In which case, we could maybe tackle that and get it done sooner. We did do that. Stacey Peralta came on because he was one of the subjects of it, and a talented filmmaker. So Dogtown and Z-Boys, the documentary, came around after the rights to the feature were sold and was obviously made and released before the feature, which I won't comment on. I also, but
On camera.
Oh yeah. So did I answer? I don't think I answered your question, but
I think that comes around to it. But for the three of you, then it's a little different. It sounds like for Mark and for Nancy, it's a very similar journey. And so you retained rights, correct?
Yeah, I didn't waste any time. I just wanted to say, based on what Stephen said, if you do get the instinct, and you feel like this could make a great narrative film, I would say don't wait to get to have that discussion with your subject. Have it, because about a week after we had the discussion with Prof, and he agreed to give us, who's the main character in our documentary, and he agreed to let us option his story rights, I got a call from his son. And he said, Mark, we have a problem. I said, what? He said, well, a big Hollywood director has just called me, and he really wants the story. He heard it on NPR, and what should I tell him? And I said, tell him he's too late. So if you get the instinct, I would say go with it, because someone else is going to have the instinct too.
And Nancy, same thing?
Well, in our case, it was fortunate that we decided to move forward with the doc, and it was partly because the Loving Family was feeling a little bit bruised by a film that had been made for Showtime in 1995 for TV, where they had given they had signed the rights agreements and were not happy with the way they were depicted. And so it took a while for me to even be able to approach them, and I did through the lawyers, but because we were going to make a documentary and not a feature film at that stage, they had, and we were promising to the extent that we possibly could to be as authentic and as true to their story in this documentary form. It made a huge difference to them. So I think had I started to get a little bit earlier traction on the feature film, I would have run into a big problem. So the documentary allowed them to develop confidence in our ability to make this movie. And now that we've gone back to them to license their rights, we're even bringing Peggy on as a consultant to the narrative, she feels a lot better about the team involved and believes that we'll do something more honest as far as they're concerned.
But now, Mark, are you going to direct the feature?
Yeah.
But you are not going to direct
I'm
your
not
feature?
directing it for one particular reason, and that is that by the time we started to develop the narrative, I was already moving on to other things, and I felt like I had exhausted, not my interests, that's for sure. I'm fascinated by their story, but I felt a fresh view would be healthy for the film. And I'm not saying that it should be differently for you, but I just felt like it was time for me to move on. It was time to bring on somebody fresh. So the people that are involved in the narrative are, I'm working with a producing team that it's called Rain Dog Films, but it's Colin Firth is actually the producer with a man named Jed Dougherty, and the three of us are producing together. And we've brought on Jeff Nichols, who did Take Shelter, to write the script, and he's in the middle of writing it right now, and assuming that that all goes well, he'll probably direct it as well. So we ended up putting together a terrific team. Colin and I met through his wife, actually, just by chance, and he and I actually started developing a screenplay together. And then he got a little busy. He got nominated for one Oscar and then another Oscar, and before I knew it, we could barely get ourselves on the phone to talk about the script. So we both said, you know what, this isn't the right time, because Colin was thinking about directing it too. This is not the right time for us to try to write the script. Let's bring on somebody else. Let's do it properly and just get this thing moving, because the documentary had brought attention to the story, and if we didn't take advantage of that, we'd be silly.
So, Marshall, what about your involvement? Is there a bit of handing over your baby, or are you going to be intimately involved?
So I am an executive producer of the project. I'm not directing it. I'm not writing it. But I've had lots of conversations and given notes on the script and that sort of thing. So, but ultimately, no, I don't get creative control of it. And I actually was curious to ask a question about how to protect your subjects when if you have gotten their life rights earlier, but you're not directing the project. So I've always felt like I know that I can convince somebody to let me into their life, to tell me intimate things about themselves on a project that I control creatively, because I know that I'm not going to screw people. And so And ultimately, I know I'm going to sit in a room with the subjects of my films and have to be able to say, this is really how I saw it, and I think you'll feel, even if you don't love every minute of this film, that this is a true depiction of the time that we spent together. But I've always been a little uneasy about asking somebody to give me their life rights that then I was going to turn around and pass on to a studio that I don't have that level of control over. And I don't know, it's just something that I puzzled myself.
Well, one thing I can say is that there is no guarantees. And once they sign those contracts, they are allowing you not only to use their story, but also have some creative liberties, because that's written into the contract. So I think it's about the team that's working on it, that they have to give that person confidence. And I personally had to have confidence that the producers and Jeff Nichols, who comes from the South, who really got the story, and talked with me at great length about the values inherent in the story, that he was going to capture this. But at the end of the day, I don't have ultimate creative. I mean, we're all working as a team, and I think that he would want the producers to feel just as good as he feels about it. But you know, it's that creative.
Does the subject who has given you their life rights, when you guys have had conversations with the next party, how, like, does that subject, if they don't get a great feeling, do they get veto power over it, or how does that work?
In my case, just very briefly, we did introduce Jeff to Peggy Loving, and she fell in love with him. So I think,
then it's easy.
yeah, right.
I think it works both ways. And I also think there are no guarantees, as you say. But the important thing to remember is that if you don't honor the subject, then you're not going to get the endorsement of that subject. And everybody, truthfully, would really rather have whoever it is that the story is based on to be out there promoting the film in a very positive way. And it's worked for me both ways. I developed a Ray Charles story many, many years ago and had the lovely opportunity to sit with him and meet with him. And he grabbed my hand and he said, "I just need you to promise me you're going to make a beautiful film." And I said, "I can't do that." I said, "Well, we're all going to sign off on the best possible script and agree on the best possible director for this. And at the end of the day, we don't know what we're going to have." And that gave him pause. He didn't walk, but it turned out that another entity was developing a script as well, and they had $70 million to make it with. So that ended that story. The other...
That was going to be a beautiful film, right? $70 million can buy a lot of beauty.
The other thing I wanted to mention is that I actually bought a book. It's not the same, obviously, called No Blacks, No Dogs, No Irish. It was the Johnny Rotten story. And I gave Johnny the ability to kill the deal, because the one thing you don't want to have is Johnny Rotten out there saying bad things about your movie, and if he's not endorsing it, you're not going to get the music. If you don't have the music, what's the point of making the movie? But he had 3 or 4 years in which to veto the script. He didn't, and I was putting it together, and I had a $7 million and Penelope Spheris to direct at the time, and I think it was Orlando Bloom to play him. And I said, "We're ready to go." And he said, "I don't want to do it." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, we didn't have no fucking fridge." And I said, what are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, page 29, it says Johnny gets up and goes to the fridge and gets a beer. And we didn't have no fucking fridge." And I said, we'll lose the fridge. You had 4 years to give me notes, you know? Turns out he really didn't want this movie to get made, and it was very apparent. And I had been burned by trying to honor somebody's life. By the way, I think he's a lovely guy and a talented guy, but complex, and I think as fearful as the next person, and probably felt like if we made this movie and nobody cared, it would make him, it would crush him. And I can think of no other reason. But so it goes both ways. You have to have mutual trust. And when you're trying to honor somebody and pay money to do that and invest your time in your relationships, they have to have, a bit of trust in you as well.
Well, and you bring up a very interesting point. So, look, very often the subjects that are covered in these films can be somewhat mercurial. It's what makes them interesting people, whether they're historical or not. So, but yet, I think of all of your films, and I love these subjects. I mean, we walk away with a dear sense of them, and so they're treated lovingly. And we've certainly talked after many a film here about mutual trust with a subject, and I can think of no better example even than R.J. Cutler's recent film with Dick Cheney. Very difficult, very difficult for him to walk that line with that film, and to get his trust and at the same time tell the truth with that film that he wanted to tell. So, and Steve, you've probably not made more films than you've made, and you've made a lot of movies for those very reasons, that these mercurial subjects can slip in and out of approval. Yet, Marshall, I mean, I think your point is really well taken. You love these subjects, correct?
Right.
And you're handing them over to a certain extent, even as executive producer. I didn't realize you were actually EP on it. And that gives you a certain amount of control.
It gives you a voice, but not control.
Right.
So you can pound your fist, but nobody has to listen. They can
Wow.
escort you out. Yeah.
Wow.
But I would say we all love our subjects and deeply, and we have a responsibility. We're the shepherds and we're the guardians of their story. And so I do think it's what Nancy said. It's the company you keep. It's who comes around. It's not about selling the rights to the highest bidder in Hollywood. That would be despicable. Because you, as the holder of those rights, you do have a responsibility. And so, in the case of Thunder Soul, I can speak personally. It was an organic process. We didn't go out and hawk our wares around the town. A few people came to us, and they resonated with the documentary on a soul level. They were emotionally moved, and they loved the story, and they fell in love with these people. And so, those are the people that we now have in the room with us when we're face to face with, in this case, Paramount. Paramount's a big corporation, and they want to do, they're gonna want to buff the edges and take the mercury out of the mercurial, and we have a team of producers with us who hold these people dear, and that's essential when you're dealing with Hollywood, because they don't really care.
So let's talk about where you are with that right now. Where are you in pre-production?
No, we're in the script. We're in the process of bringing on our screenwriter. The project is at Paramount and being produced by Kennedy Marshall, Frank Marshall, and Jamie Foxx. So that's the team of people behind it. And the way that it happened was that Frank came to a screening. He came to a screening and he was moved. And the producers called and said, you're never going to guess who was in the audience at this random screening, but Frank Marshall. And I said, wow, and we did, and then the same thing kind of happened with Jamie. Is that his producing partner Jamie King saw the movie. She was very moved, and she called us. And 4 months later, we had a meeting with Fox, and he sat with us, and he said, this is my story. I want this story to be told. So. It all happened kind of organically, and now those people are the people that are kind of, in the ring while we're fighting.
But organically because you had boundaries as well, which it sounds like, you were looking for someone that was resonating. And Marshall, with you, where are you? Where is this?
So they're doing rewrites of the script. The director, Lance Accord, is on board. He is Sofia Coppola and Spike Jonze' cinematographer, and does a ton of really amazing commercial work. He did that the commercial of the kid Darth Vader, that gets the card. And so he's got a commercial company that does amazing work, and obviously knows his way around a really creative film set too. So and in fact, we're going to be getting together with a writer, and he and I are going to probably be coming down to spend a little time with Annabeth's family. She's the little girl in the documentary. In the documentary, the kids are 11, 12, and 13. In the fiction version, they're 16 and 17, which is great because that's how old she is right now. And she continues to race full-size race cars, and so we're going to come and watch some races and spend some time with them. And so it's moving very well and quickly, but it's Hollywood, so you never know what's actually going to get made.
Let me ask Steve a very quick question, because you wanted to talk, when we talked about this, about script in particular and about treatments. Can you talk a little about that? Because it seems like the very architect of a film, as we've often heard when you move into narrative, is the script. And we're hearing now about being in that very important process of building the platform that a film will be built upon.
I'm going to digress and back into that, because I had developed a movie called What We Do Is Secret, and it's the story of Darby Crash and this punk rock band, the seminal West Coast punk band called The Germs. He had been the subject of Penelope Spheeris's movies, The Decline of Western Civilization 1 and 2, and in our script, we didn't base the movie, we based it on a book. In our script, and I went to high school with him, so I actually knew him and had a fairly good and interesting relationship with him. But in the script, we had recreated scenes from Penelope's documentary. And and she was, very aware of the project, and we ultimately shot scenes, iconic scenes from the documentary, which was basically Darby, the very famous scene where he was cooking eggs in the kitchen one morning with his then girlfriend. And she, I think probably to her credit, although I would rather she had said yes, after the fact said, I don't want you using that, because she took the position that that was her intellectual property and that she had shot those scenes and they were hers and we didn't have the right to recreate them. So we ultimately took them out of the movie. They were originally scripted and I think would have made the story much richer and would have tied together the doc and the narrative much more cohesively, but we couldn't do it. She didn't want to do it. And I respect that. I mean, it wasn't really a battle. It was just something that we all need to keep in mind if that ever comes up again. I would have loved to have used that, and probably should have done a better job figuring that out beforehand. Because we also, had a limited budget to shoot with, and we shouldn't have wasted those days shooting material that we weren't able to use anyhow. So, getting back to the script question, I think that you have to. I think at the end of the day, if it's about somebody, you should give them what would be considered creative consultancy, because if you give them approvals, you have nothing, in my opinion, because you're at the mercy of their moods or at the mercy of, some other giant coming in and telling them to say no to what you have so that we can do it together. And again, I don't know how else to answer that question but to say that if you give somebody approvals, that's fine. You probably have, but at that point you just literally have nothing. But their trust in you.
And Nancy, you wanted to say something about that?
Well, I just wanted to get back to the issue of the studio involvement, because I think that's also very an important lesson. Though it sounds like The Loving Story is pretty far along because we have a writer working on the script and we've got some pretty high-profile producers involved. We're really still in development. And we've gone out of our way to stay away from studios at this stage. And frankly, we will stay away from them as long as we can. We would like to get this film almost in production before. We've got some studios interested, but we really don't want them interfering with it if we can help it. So we've raised some development funds, and we have enough money to get the script written. And it's anybody's guess what's going to happen after that. But I do feel like we have enough chefs in this already. If we can keep the studios out for a while and deliver something pretty final, and as far as our script is concerned, we'll have a lot more control over it.
If I could just offer something on that, I hear that, and then the caveat with that is that business affairs in studios are snails. I mean, it's like a snail crossing the Sahara. It is so arduous, and so we too are in development, but thankfully we've crossed, we've passed the camel through the needle, which is business affairs. And so I would say you can do that simultaneously. You can still be in creative. You can still be developing your script. You can still be securing a talent attachment, all that stuff. But it's going to take you so long to get through because more or less the studios are making much bigger movies than your documentary becoming a feature, and they've got their tentpole movies that are taking up business affairs time. So if you can just start the process, I would say start it, because you're going to end up having to go through that time. And in the case of Thunder Soul, that was a year of our life. It took a year, just to get, sometimes 6 months just to get an email returned.
We're also, by the way, I'm also working on a narrative version of The Donner Party, which is a classic documentary made by Rick Burns, and he and I had been brainstorming and dreaming and hoping about this for almost 5 years. And then when Hatfield and McCoy's did so well, suddenly studios who we talked to a couple of years ago popped up and started calling us. We have sold that to HBO, original programming, and I absolutely agree with you. I've never seen anything go so slowly as Business Affairs. So we're moving forward. We're just not giving them anything. Until we sign those deals and we have the money in the bank, they're not seeing a thing.
Yeah, we're not having creative conversations. I mean, they are chiming in on writers, but we're not in the room talking story with them.
Right.
Interesting. Marshall, is that similar with you? Not, I mean, like keeping the involvement till the last minute so that you have a little bit of control before they get in?
No, I mean, we did that deal very quickly. So it was just, they said they were interested, we negotiated it, bang, and
I mean,
it
in
was
some
done,
way,
so.
I could see your film becoming a tentpole movie. Same thing with yours, actually, because they're dynamic. I mean, there's music involved in yours. There's race cars involved in yours. So aren't race cars necessary to a tentpole film? I don't know.
So crashes. anyway.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. Chases.
I just want to throw in, by the way, just in case I need to say a few things. Have to until I'm just have this fear that you're going to pull the plug. I just want to pay homage to to Grey Gardens because that gives all of us hope. That's a movie that was 30 years ago, not necessarily dead in the water, but iconic and not really on everybody's front burner, and it becomes a hit musical and a great HBO movie. So there's hope for any of it, and the great stories endure, and there's not necessarily a ticking clock on any of it. It just might not be in our lifetimes. But I just think it's a great thing to note, and it speaks to the power of a great story and a great subject. Because I liked both. I loved both.
I mean, I've always been curious if there are people in development at the studios assigned to just watch documentaries. Because, of course, obviously I love the form. It's what I do. Yeah. But I watch documentaries all the time and think, feature, narrative.
Much cheaper, by the way, than going after books. And, because they're dead in the water. They're lying fallow. It's a crazy, rich, rich... some pile of something from which to cull.
That's the other advantage to going into the narrative after the documentary, and that is that you're more likely to get funding. I mean, the financing has come through fairly quickly with The Loving Story, and again, it's just development at this stage, but they've seen the documentary. They believe in it, they trust it, they know there's an audience, they know there's an emotional story there. They don't really need to get sold on much else.
But what, like Steve said, is that you finally, if you make something, you have a property.
Yep.
You have a property that someone then has to option or pay you for or have your permission for, whether it's an article or a book, but in this case, even a short documentary. And I'm curious how many filmmakers out there actually knew that. There are a lot of people with a lot of experience in the house, but how many people understood that relationship before don't be shy. Okay, so nobody knew that. Nobody knew that? No, come on. David Wilson, you knew that. Thank you. Thank you. I know there are people out there that knew that. In fact, do we feel comfortable asking questions at this point? I think we could be ready. Oh, I think we have plenty. All right.
So I recently heard a number for the first time about what somebody just sold the remake rights for a documentary for to a, let's say, major Hollywood producer. And the number for me was shockingly low. The number was $25,000. And I just want to get your takes on numbers and kind of you can talk about numbers in your own lives.
So, Steve, you'd probably know a little bit about that.
It doesn't shock me, but it also is not necessarily. I mean, if nobody else is knocking, you probably take it. So you're in business with that person and whoever they are, and something's happening, or it basically, sets off a light bulb in your own head to say, "Wow, somebody wants it. I'm not going to give it away for $25,000. I'm going to go out there and develop it myself, or find somebody that's willing to pay more, or own it, and develop the
time
future."
limit as well, right? I mean, isn't there usually a time limit on these things?
I guess
If you don't
unless you buy it
develop
outright.
Reversion of rights if they don't do
Right.
it within a certain period of time.
It doesn't shock me, the number, because frankly, that's what Molly would pay for the rights to run on A&E, so, and then whoever that person is has to spend however much money developing it and finding a writer and paying that writer presumably, and it might be an interesting number if they partner with that person and make them an executive producer and give them a piece of the action. That would be a nice motivator.
And there are two numbers, right? There's the option price, which means that somebody gets a 1 or a 2 or whatever year option. And then if they decide to actually make it and it gets fully funded, then there's a purchase price. And those numbers are usually quite different, I think.
Yes.
So I want to ask about this prior ownership thing. I'm trying to write a script on Two Slaves. Somebody's already written a novel about these slaves, and somebody else sort of made a short quite a while ago. But both the novel and the short are aimed at a very young audience. And I actually, my script is just based on their story. It's not really their story as such. In fact, it's like a collaboration of several stories. And their owners. So it's different kinds of things. Are you telling me that I have to get permission from these other people?
You don't have to. I mean, you have to think about all the things that will add towards your ability to make this. And sometimes finances are a lot more comfortable if you've gotten the rights. It's a way of claiming it, that nobody else is going to go and do the same thing you've done. The underlying rights issue is all about people having confidence in the story and confidence in your ability to market this thing. So it's a gamble. You can do it if these stories are in the public domain. You don't have to. But it's just a question of making yourself and your project more marketable.
But it has to be true and accurate. So you can't use somebody and use their name and then fictionalize their lives. So you have to be able to back what it is you're writing about.
Even if these people die of something.
Well, that's tough. I mean, I don't know.
I would think they
You can-
wouldn't have rights. No,
You
I
can
think
you
they
can
do.
say it's inspired by them. I mean,
Yeah.
it could be inspired by them. I mean, you could take some creative, a lot of creative license if you want. But then there's the other issue of why even use their names at all if you're not going to base it on their lives.
Which is why we call this based on a true story. It's exactly that point. I think it's interesting when Steve brought up the Johnny Rotten story. I think what you hear from a lot of experienced people in the business, correct me if I'm wrong, is people never really want to get into a rights tussle. Nobody ever wants to end up that far. And so you'd rather say no and cut bait than ever get into an issue. So it's best to protect yourself up front as much as possible. Full disclosure, lived in LA for 18 years, so I know this story. But that you want to protect yourself, and then at a certain point, you just don't want to get into it. And producers don't either. It's very rare to see any production company or a studio take something to the mat, and they'd rather just not spend the money. They'll just back away. So it's better to have all your ducks in a row. And as Nancy said, why use their names at all then, and just write your script, using them as inspiration. Yeah, right here.
Hi, I have a question. I guess we talked a little bit about responsibility to subjects, and I'm kind of wondering how that plays out in terms of, like, for example, if you hear a story and you're thinking this would be great as a documentary or great as a narrative. So specifically, like, I just came from God Loves Uganda and was talking a bit with Ben, the editor, about it's a documentary about the persecution of gays and lesbians in Uganda and how there weren't any or weren't many explicit interviews with members of the community because of safety issues and ethical issues that they couldn't put them on screen, whereas in a narrative, if your subject is in a documentary being themselves versus in a narrative, you can have an actor and they're not so much put at risk. I guess, is that a concern, or has that been a concern in terms of will this really function better as a story and be safer for the subject of my film narrative?
So I'm just going to repeat the question because we realize the cameras can't always hear it. So she's saying, when you're worried about the safety of a subject, have these filmmakers considered, instead of doing a documentary, doing it as a feature to retain their safety when they could be in danger for what you show? Anybody thought about that? I don't know if any. Steve, have you had a film in that category before?
I mean, I'm involved in a film now called State of Control, and the filmmakers were going. They basically went undercover in China to pose as carpet salesmen to actually expose the Chinese control of the internet and their oppression of the Tibetan people. And they got into trouble, and they got poisoned, and lots of things happened. But I think that at the end of the day, you go out and make the best movie you can make, and if you believe... In fact, there's a filmmaker in the movie that was a teen named Dundop, who's actually in prison now in China. His family was harassed and detained, and we received letters from people in the Tibetan community that they think that what we had done may have compromised him, and so we backpedaled a little bit and tried to do whatever it took to soften that, how his portrayal and the relationship to the Chinese government. But that was really more to protect him. In fact, in the Ai Weiwei documentary, which was brilliant last year, which I should have been thanked on, by the way, Larry Warsh, Allison Clayman, where are you? There you are. I was not thanked. And Larry said, when I asked him, I said, "What are you talking? Why didn't you thank me?" He said, "Well, next time." I said, "Oh yeah, the next Ai Weiwei 2, you can thank me on." In any event, I think the most important thing that they did in their documentary to protect him was to make the documentary, because the sea of people that are now followers and lovers of him are the very reason why the Chinese government will not, and Allison, correct me if I'm wrong, is the reason why the Chinese government probably won't harm him.
Yeah, I've always said I didn't, while he was in detention, I really didn't know, like for those 80 days, I was really on the fence about whether it was going to help or not. And then on day 81 when he got out, it seemed pretty clear that international pressure didn't work.
So everybody, Allison Clayman, the director of Ai Weiwei. I mean, this is what I love about the Speakeasy. We have Mr. Pennebaker, David Wilson, Allison Clayman. I can't see past the lights, but I just love that we have all these great filmmakers in the room. So please do speak up and join the conversation. That's why Molly created this venue with us. It's for that kind of discussion. Yes, right here.
All of you have, I'm sure, a million stories that strike you as you go to approach a subject, whether it's thinking maybe this is enough, maybe this is a narrative. Are they thinking, I mean, more and more people now think of themselves on the side of a camera, on the performance side of the camera, just because of YouTube. How do you approach somebody who sees you coming and you have a wonderful idea or a wonderful way to tell their story, and the first thing they want to hear about is, what can you do for me money-wise?
That's a great question. So she's asking, when you approach a subject nowadays, are they thinking about what's in it for me financially? And I know even when I produced documentaries, we had come up against that a lot. There was a particular great basketball player I was working with on something, and he wanted to work with a lot of his players in college. And many of those guys did not make it to the NBA, and they were not famous, and they all wanted to talk about money. And I was like, wow, we're just trying to make a documentary. There's no money to be had. But I'm going to let everybody else up here speak about that. It is a very savvy group of people now, because is it because of reality television, do you think? Is it a YouTube issue that people want to be paid?
I think people, go ahead. I think people always want to get paid. Yeah. But it's a lot about the trust that you form with your subject. And that's the first thing. And then it's also about a reality check for them. It's an education process, because it's like Marshall said, it's a tiered situation. You don't start out with the mother lode of money. First, it's an option, and that's a small amount of money. And then you graduate to more amount of money. And then when principal photography hits, you get more amount of money. And then you talk about back end. So part of that is sitting down and saying, look, I'm just an independent filmmaker. I'm not DreamWorks. I'm not Spielberg. I'm just a documentary filmmaker who thinks your story is wonderful and could resonate in terms of a fiction. But it's a long road. I mean, it's really about educating them to the process that you're going to be going through as well as the filmmaker, because you're going to be dealing with the same tiers as well. So it's a reality check. And when people understand that it's not the lottery, you really have to educate people on that, because people hear Hollywood and they think that the streets are paved with gold, and it's far from that truth. So it's about educating them.
And they feel that way even with documentary. I mean, whether or not they are here in Hollywood, they're still thinking filmmaker, you're coming in, you have money, you're bringing cameras, there's money there. There were people who would not ultimately talk to us on The Loving Story because Mildred and Richard Loving had made a certain amount of money from selling their story 40 years ago. And they were annoyed that they hadn't reaped some of those benefits. So they would not cooperate on the documentary at all. But the family, the immediate family, took some convincing, more because they wanted to feel that the story was going to be told in an authentic way. However, when we moved into the narrative, that's when we realized we really did have to start speaking money to them, and we brought them on. First of all, we did explain to them that in a way it's kind of like journalism. It's not kosher to pay people when you're doing documentaries. Some people do, but we preferred not to. But were we to move into a narrative film, we would certainly try to make them a little bit more part of that. And we did. And so we brought Peggy on as a consultant. She's going to get some money. We'll give her a little of the back end. You know, they're going to see some benefits. So she just kind of had to be patient, and now it's working out.
Steve?
Yeah, I was going to, apropos that, patience is everything, and you can say to whoever that person is, if you can find, you have to be willing to lose anything at the end of the day. And if you can say to that person, find somebody who's more passionate, who's willing to pay you more money that you think will get this made and honor you, go for it. And more likely than not, more often than not, they won't, and they'll come back to you and say, you know, I thought about it, and let's do this.
Do you want to add something, Marshall?
Oh, no, it was really the same. I feel like generally my gut sense is that not paying people for documentaries and saying, well, listen, this is a documentary. I'm not making a lot of money. Nobody's making a lot of money. I'm just trying to tell your story. If a fiction thing comes in and somebody wants to make something out of your life, it seems to me like that person should share in whatever that money is that's coming in. So.
Yes, right here in the blue shirt.
Thank you. I'm not in the industry, but I do watch a lot of documentaries. I participate in this. Some time ago, I was over at the Center for Documentaries just across the street, and they had a documentary that I came just a few minutes late, and I didn't realize it was a fake documentary. I think it was a woodpecker or something. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but in documentaries, there is a boundary. You know, you're telling a true story. Is there any merit, or how does the stage feel about something that's produced that's like a fake documentary?
Mockumentaries.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I think the form is shifting radically. I think with the Banksy film, and I mean, everybody up here obviously is more experienced than I am, and I know the form is rapidly evolving and expanding. But that's part of what the curated series, but by Amir Bar-Lev, is exploring right now. So I invite you to come to his speakeasy tomorrow, because he's going to be talking about that. But what about everybody up here? What about, what do you think of the form shifting and how it's evolved? I mean, even, Spinal Tap, of course, being years ago, but still. It's a little different now. It's not openly a mockumentary sometimes.
Well, this festival has had a tradition of dealing with hybrid films.
Right.
And
The fact that term even exists
That's right.
says that there is this merging of.
Exactly, and I think it's exciting, and I think we all agree that a good story, as Deirdre said, is a good story. So whatever form it takes is a wonderful opportunity. And if we start blurring the boundaries, the hardest thing about blurring boundaries in documentary is selling the film, because if you're trying to convince people to show your film, they want to know what it is they're showing. And particularly television. If you're selling it to the documentary unit of a particular network, they want to know it's a real documentary, and they don't want a lot. Well, I don't want to get into reenactments and all of that. It's a big question and a big issue. It really is. It really is. So.
I mean, I think it's an incredibly exciting time for documentarians because the form has embraced artistic expression in a way that it never has before. I mean, when Mr. Pennebaker started out, they weren't incorporating animation into films. It was verite. Now you can, but what doesn't change, I think, is a responsibility to truth. So if like Cutie and the Boxer is a great example. What a gorgeous film, right? And animation used in a very beautiful way, but it's the woman's work. It's organic to the truth of the story. The same thing with the Tom Ungerer film. It's his work. I think the filmmaker can take creative license. We have a lot more tools in our toolbox now as filmmakers. We can do incredible things. But we still have a responsibility to tell a truthful, honest story. It's not fiction. It's not a mockumentary. A mockumentary is entertaining. It's wonderful. I love Christopher Guest. I could watch him all day long. But he's not a documentarian, and I don't think he should be categorized as such. And I don't think he'd want to be either.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, at that time, verite was the new thing. It was breaking the rules. And I think it's so interesting that technology and the affordability of the technology has allowed the documentarian's toolbox to be bigger. That there's more paint to paint with. There's more to tell those stories with. Is there somebody else? Yes, right here.
So, in a case where you're the filmmaker, you're the documentarian, and you help develop this project to a fictional film, and then basically, as normally seems to happen halfway through, somebody else takes control of it, whether it be the guys in marketing or a producer who knows we need to do this, and they just completely tear apart the character, the reality of your movie, to create this great fictional, this is going to be a brilliant moment even though it has nothing to do with your film. When do you as a filmmaker have the right to announce, this isn't my movie that we made, this isn't even close to the truth? When are you allowed to dissociate yourself from the fictional film?
Oh, you all must have good answers to this as you
That's
go
the
through the process.
That's the Smythe question. I mean, honestly, if you take your name off a film, you are basically making a statement. I'm not a director. I co-directed a doc that I'm proud of, but I'm not a director. So I would leave that to the filmmaker.
Yeah, but does it have to do with the role that you took, whether you're an executive producer or a consultant, or or do you just hush up? I mean, Mark, you're going to direct, correct? So you're going to have that discussion. You're going to be able to fight that fight. And I would imagine Marshall, as an executive producer, you're going to, like as you said, pound your fist on the table.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Racing Dreams, there's no sort of historical truth that has political significance that I'm wedded to, and if they distorted something would be offensive to me. I know that they are going to make a fiction movie about growing up and racing. And so it's a little bit different from, my first film, Street Fight, was optioned, and it's about a guy who's running for mayor of Newark, New Jersey, Cory Booker, and that needed to be told in a more if the fiction film ended up not getting made, but if it were to be made, it needs to follow. You couldn't just make up scandals that happened that didn't happen, or you couldn't. There's a historical significance that needs to be that the fiction film needs to be truthful about. So I also think it matters a little bit about what the topic of the film is, whether how the characters feel about it. The characters in the fiction version of Racing Dreams, they're not going to have the same names. I mean, it is based on Racing Dreams, but it's not a fictional version of Racing Dreams. So to me, it's more a question of, is this going to be a good movie, not have we strayed too far from my documentary.
And ultimately, isn't something a good movie because you work with partners you trust? I mean, don't you choose your work partners not just by how much they can pay you, but by people you trust and want to work with? Mark?
Yeah, but I mean, I just want to say, to Marshall's point, you're not making a facsimile of your documentary. It's a different movie, and you are taking creative license. And so in the case of Thunder Soul, we are not doing a copy of the film. We're taking composites of people's lives. Oh, this, a little bit of here, a little bit of there, so that we can avoid as much as possible what you're saying, because that is a really rough and complicated line. We do have a main character, and he is a man who lived on this earth for 92 years and was an honest person with family and people who love him and are safeguarding his reputation. And we have a responsibility, and that's probably where we're going to have to fight. So there will be fights, but you can get around it because you're not making the literal. You're doing a fictional adaptation.
Well, on the plane yesterday, I was flying in with Patrick Creedon and his wife, Christine O'Malley, who'd made.
If you build it.
If you build, but they made a film. Was it IO USA?
Yeah.
IO USA, which Tom Hanks bought the rights to, and so Patrick was saying, Tom was saying that he'd like one of the characters to be played by Paul Giamatti, and Patrick said, "Well, who do you like to play the other character?" He said, "Me, of course." And then he said, "So how do you envision telling the story?" He said, "You told it. We bought the documentary. That's what we want to make." So he sees the narrative feature in the documentary the way it is, for the most part, and even some of the dialogue, or all of it, for that matter.
Wow. Last word, Nancy.
Last word.
No, we're wrapping up.
In both cases, in The Loving Story and in The Donner Party, both of those films are being made primarily because we felt we couldn't do enough with the documentaries, that we could take the story to another place. So in The Loving Story, the overall arc is the court case and getting to know the Lovings and their love story, but it is also their court case. In the fiction film, we're really going to focus much more on the love story and the community that allowed that love story to blossom. So those were things that we really couldn't explore enough in the documentary to satisfy ourselves. We're thrilled that we have an opportunity to take that story further. And the same thing with the Donner Party. That's a top-down look at a very large saga. We're going to deal with the characters and let the characters really drive that narrative. So we have opportunities, and we're excited about the ability to branch out of the documentary and do something different.
This has been a great topic, and I have to thank everybody. I hope you'll all help me to thank this enormously talented panel. Thank you so much. I wish we had more time, but we have to wrap it up, and I know people have to get to films. Thank you. We'll have another speakeasy at 3:30. Thank you.
I want to thank Pennebaker for being Pennebaker. What a icon. And sitting through us. That's great.